The officer's initial disrespect and smirk toward the Army officer didn't come out of nowhere. It was built on layers of assumption, bias, and the false confidence of someone who believes the badge on his chest gives him power over another man's dignity. When he first approached the vehicle, he wasn't looking for information or clarity. He was looking for dominance. His posture said it all. Shoulders pulled back, chin slightly raised, that half-smile curling as if he'd already judged the man inside without a single word spoken. The Army officer sat with discipline, hands visible, breathing steady, following every protocol he had been trained to respect, not because he feared the situation, but because he respected the uniform, both his own and the one standing outside his window. Yet the cop didn't see the calm professionalism as confidence. He misread it as compliance. He smirked the way someone does when they believe they're untouchable, when they believe the other person has no power, no voice, no authority. There was no acknowledgement of the officer's service badge on his chest, no glance at the uniform that represented years of sacrifice, leadership, and earned honor. Instead, the cop's eyes skimmed over everything meaningful and settled only on the one thing he decided mattered: the man's skin color. The disrespect began even in the way he tapped on the window. Sharp, impatient, almost mocking, followed by a tone laced with unnecessary attitude. He didn't ask questions, he barked them. He didn't listen. He waited for any excuse to assert control. And every time the Army officer responded with calm clarity, it only seemed to feed the cop's smugness, as though he believed he had full control of the narrative. That smirk deepened each time he interrupted, each time he talked down to the man who outranked him in every sense except the one that the cop was clinging to in that moment. The cop's body language displayed a confidence that wasn't earned. It was borrowed from a system that too often lets arrogance grow unchecked. As the Army officer tried to understand the reason for the stop, the cop seemed almost entertained by the confusion. He leaned in slightly, letting that crooked smile spread across his face, as if the discomfort or concern of the other man was something amusing. He expected intimidation. He expected fear. He expected the kind of reaction he was used to receiving when he asserted power over people who had no way to push back. But what truly fueled that smirk was the assumption that this moment would be one-sided. In his mind, he was in control. In his mind, this was routine. In his mind, this was just another driver he could belittle without consequence. He spoke over the Army officer multiple times, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to reinforce the hierarchy he believed existed. A hierarchy that placed him above the very individual whose service allowed him to wear his own uniform in the first place. The officer noticed the disrespect, but stayed steady, refusing to match rudeness with anger, refusing to let the cop's smirk provoke a reaction. Yet the more calm and composed he remained, the more the cop mistook patience for weakness. The smirk wasn't just disrespectful. It was dismissive, carrying the weight of a man who believed he had already won whatever silent contest he imagined was taking place. Every movement the Army officer made, slow, deliberate, respectful, only seemed to inflate the cop's ego further. When he reached for his identification, the cop placed his hand near his weapon, but not out of safety, out of theatrics. The smirk returned the moment he felt the Army officer hesitate, not because the officer was afraid, but because he was cautious. That hesitation was misinterpreted, twisted into something the cop used to convince himself he had full control. He seemed to enjoy asserting unnecessary authority, standing just a little too close, speaking just a little too harshly, all while wearing that same smug smile that suggested he believed he was dealing with someone who had no support, no status, no recourse. The moment the officer spoke with clarity, identifying his rank, the cop didn't react with respect. He laughed softly under his breath, that same smirk planted on his face, as if the idea of this man being anything more than a target for his ego was ridiculous. He didn't look at the patches, the insignia, the name, or the uniform with the seriousness they deserved. He didn't pause to reconsider his tone or his assumptions. He simply carried on, confident that nothing about this situation could possibly challenge him. The smirk wasn't just an expression. It was a message one that carried the weight of arrogance, misunderstanding, and a deeply rooted belief that he held all the power in this encounter. Unaware that everything he assumed was about to be shattered within moments, the calm, disciplined response from the Army officer stood in absolute contrast to the tension the cop was trying to provoke, creating a silence in the air that held more strength than any raised voice ever could. From a moment he realized this stop was going sideways, the Army officer made a deliberate choice. A choice rooted in training, humility, and decades of learning to control his emotions even under the most stressful conditions. He kept his breathing steady, his tone measured, and his movements slow, not out of fear, but out of respect for procedures he had followed his entire career. Every action was precise, every word weighed carefully, reflecting a man who understood that true authority doesn't need to be shouted or enforced with force. It's something carried quietly, confidently, and unmistakably. As the cop leaned in with arrogance dripping from every word, the Army officer didn't allow himself to mirror that energy. Instead, he kept his eyes forward, speaking only when necessary, offering explanations without raising his voice, not because he owed the cop politeness, but because he refused to let anyone pull him away from the discipline that defined who he was. His uniform wasn't just fabric. It represented battles fought, missions completed, and sacrifices invisible to those who had never stepped foot into the world he had served. And with every calm reply, he was silently reminding the cop that strength doesn't always show itself through aggression. Sometimes it shows itself through restraint. When the cop barked orders, the officer complied smoothly, without hesitation, but not with submission, rather with precision. His hands remained visible, his posture upright, his voice steady. Every response demonstrated the kind of emotional intelligence and self-control that comes from years of serving in high-pressure environments. This was a man who had faced situations far more dangerous, far more chaotic, and far more consequential than a roadside encounter with an officer who misunderstood authority. His calmness wasn't weakness, it was mastery. He understood the stakes, but he also understood himself. Even when the cop attempted to provoke him with sarcasm, talking down to him as if he were inexperienced or uneducated, the Army officer remained composed. He didn't let frustration leak into his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't escalate. He simply answered. And with each answer, he revealed the poise of someone who knows his worth doesn't depend on another person's recognition. His discipline was the quiet kind, the kind that speaks through action, not volume. He followed every instruction carefully, but his calm energy created a subtle shift in the atmosphere, one that hinted he wasn't intimidated in the slightest. At one point, the cop tried to corner him with rapid-fire questions, hoping to catch him off guard, hoping to see even the slightest crack in his confidence. But the officer's responses remained clear and consistent. He didn't stumble. He didn't waver. His training had prepared him to remain level-headed, even when everything around him felt hostile or uncertain. The more chaotic the cop tried to be, the more grounded the Army officer became. The contrast between them was almost cinematic. One man fueled by ego, the other guided by discipline. There was a moment when the cop leaned in too close, intentionally invading the officer's space, expecting maybe a flinch or a defensive reaction. But the Army officer didn't move. He didn't recoil. His eyes stayed steady, his demeanor unwavering. This calmness wasn't only for his own safety. It was a silent statement that he refused to be dragged into the officer's emotional volatility. He wasn't going to give the cop the satisfaction of seeing discomfort or fear. He wasn't going to let someone else dictate his reactions. His calm was his shield, and he held it with dignity. Even when the cop became increasingly irritated by the lack of fear, the Army officer didn't let his heartbeat quicken. He didn't raise his voice to match the officer's tone. He didn't challenge the officer's rudeness, but he didn't shrink from it either. He stayed steady, like someone who had been through storms much stronger than this and learned long ago that reacting impulsively only gives away control. His discipline was a quiet power, one that didn't need to assert itself aggressively to be felt. It was leadership in its purest form, the kind that doesn't announce itself but becomes undeniable the moment pressure rises. And through this entire exchange, Every movement, every breath, every carefully chosen word showed exactly who he was beneath the uniform. A man who understood that staying calm is sometimes the strongest form of resistance, that maintaining discipline in the face of disrespect is a victory on its own, and that true strength is not measured by how loud you are, but by how unshakable you remain when someone tries to break your composure the moment the cop realized the officer's high rank and status didn't happen all at once. It unfolded in small, sharp flashes of recognition that slowly wiped the arrogance from his expression. Up until that point, he had treated the Army officer like someone beneath him, someone who had no authority, no influence, no standing beyond being another face he could intimidate. But when the officer calmly provided his identification, revealing not just his name, but his rank, something in the cop's mind began to crack. At first, he didn't even process it. He glanced at the badge, saw the insignia, but his bias made him dismiss it as unimportant. He assumed it couldn't possibly mean what it clearly did. He assumed the man in front of him couldn't hold that kind of position. His arrogance made him blind to the truth staring at him. But then the silence stretched. The Army officer sat still, composed, watching the cop's reaction with the same calm discipline he had held throughout the encounter. The cop's smirk faltered just a little as he looked back at the name, the rank, the symbols he suddenly realized he didn't fully understand. He looked again, slower this time, as if trying to confirm whether he was reading correctly. He saw the patches indicating years of service, the insignia marking leadership, the unmistakable evidence that this wasn't a junior enlisted soldier or someone unfamiliar with protocol. This was a man who commanded respect, not just in title, but in presence. The cop's posture shifted ever so slightly. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes darted between the ID and the officer's face. He cleared his throat, suddenly unsure if the tone he had been using was appropriate. But he wasn't ready to back down, not yet. His ego was fighting the reality forming in his mind. He asked a question he had already read the answer to, as if hoping the officer would correct him, give him an out, or somehow lessen the blow of his mistake. Instead, the Army officer confirmed his rank with the same calm certainty that had defined every part of the interaction. No bragging, no anger, just truth. The cop's expression shifted again. His smirk began collapsing into something more rigid. His jaw tightened. His eyes widened a fraction, betraying confusion mixed with the early signs of panic. He now understood that the man he had spoken down to wasn't just a soldier. He was someone with authority that reached far beyond the officer's patrol car. Someone who outranked him morally, professionally, and socially. Someone with connections, influence, and the power to question every decision the cop had made in the last several minutes. The realization came in waves, each stronger than the last. He noticed the uniform differently now. The fabric wasn't just a uniform anymore. It was a resume woven into every patch and stripe. The respect he had withheld earlier now pressed on him with weight. He saw the name tag and suddenly remembered hearing it somewhere. Maybe in briefing rooms, maybe in training sessions, maybe in conversations about decorated service members. Recognition flickered, and with that flicker came dread. The cop's breathing changed. He stood straighter, no longer leaning in with intimidation, but pulling back with uncertainty. He tried to regain composure, but his voice betrayed him. It no longer carried the false confidence he had earlier. It trembled slightly at the edges, the way someone sounds when they realize they've made a serious miscalculation. He tried to maintain authority, but the dynamic had shifted. The power he thought he controlled now rested firmly in the hands of the officer he'd underestimated. The cop opened his mouth to speak, but paused, realizing his tone could no longer be the same. He attempted to mask the shift with professional language he should have used from the beginning, but it was too late. The contrast was too sharp. He began double-checking everything. The officer's documents, the supposed reason for the stop, his own actions. The hesitation revealed that he was now second-guessing every word he had said. His mind raced through the encounter, realizing how dangerously out of line he had been. The uniform that had once intimidated others now intimidated him. The smirk that once displayed dominance now felt like a mistake carved into his memory. He took a step back, physically creating space he had earlier invaded. His eyes no longer held arrogance. They held calculation. His brain was working overtime, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, how to retract the disrespect without admitting fault, how to undo the damage he had caused with his assumptions. But the shift was undeniable. His demeanor changed. His breathing changed. The energy in the air changed. What terrified him most wasn't the rank itself. It was the realization that someone of such status had remained calm throughout the abuse. That kind of composure hinted at someone who wasn't just trained but deeply connected, respected, and capable of making one phone call that could change everything. And with that understanding, the cop's earlier confidence drained from him, replaced by a growing awareness that the situation was slipping far beyond his control. Sure. Here's from the moment the incident unfolded. There was an unmistakable tension in the air, a kind of quiet storm that everyone on that flight felt, but very few understood fully. In keynote number 4, the focus shifts to what happened right after the CEO was asked to vacate his VIP seat and how the atmosphere changed when passengers started recording, whispering, and exchanging glances that carried more weight than any spoken word. The flight attendants tried to maintain composure, but their nervous movements, their tightened expressions, and their hushed conversations revealed that things were slipping out of their control. Even those who initially believed the crew's explanation began to reconsider their assumptions as the CEO's calm, dignified reaction contrasted sharply with the disrespect shown to him. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't demand to be treated differently. He simply picked up his briefcase, adjusted his jacket, and stepped aside with a grace that stood in stark contrast to the arrogance displayed by the staff. That quiet strength made people around him uncomfortable, not because of him, but because of their own complicity in silence. As he walked toward the back of the plane, passengers parted like a reluctant sea, some avoiding eye contact out of shame, others watching carefully, sensing that something about this moment would not end here. The man who took his seat, the white passenger for whom the switch was made, shifted uncomfortably as whispers reached him. He hadn't asked for the seat to be changed. He had simply been informed it was now his. But even he could feel the wrongness of the situation and the way the CEO, without complaint, had given up a seat that was rightfully his. A few passengers later recounted that look. The look of someone who realized he had become part of something that would soon spiral far beyond a simple seating change. Meanwhile, the CEO sat in the cramped back row, his long legs bent awkwardly, his shoulders pressed against the seat, yet he maintained an air of quiet contemplation. Flight attendants continued glancing toward him, whispering with one another, clearly aware that the decision made earlier was going to bring consequences they had not anticipated. What they didn't know was that the CEO wasn't just influential. He was respected globally, not merely for his position, but for his principles. Passengers who recognized him were shocked, exchanging texts with friends, checking LinkedIn, confirming that this wasn't just any man. They had just witnessed the humiliation of a world-renowned corporate leader who was known for championing equality and fairness. The irony couldn't be more painful. Some passengers felt compelled to approach him, offering apologies, expressing discomfort with what they had seen, and asking whether he wanted them as witnesses if he planned to report the incident. He thanked them quietly but declined assistance, still giving the benefit of the doubt, still refusing to escalate the situation publicly. That restraint only made the injustice feel heavier. But the real shift happened when one passenger, an elderly woman sitting 2 rows in front, stood up with trembling hands and spoke loudly enough for the flight attendants to hear. She questioned the treatment he received and asked why a paying customer, who had checked in early and confirmed his seat, was moved. When her voice carried through the aisle, others chimed in, some with frustration, some with anger. A ripple formed into a wave of collective disapproval. The flight attendants tried to justify, stumbling over words, saying it was a preference adjustment, then a technical error, then a priority reassignment. Every explanation contradicted the last. People filmed. People sent messages. People documented. The quiet humiliation of one man was suddenly no longer just his burden to carry. The passengers' growing awareness began to reshape the dynamic entirely. Even the pilots eventually became aware of the situation when the disturbance spread through the cabin. One of them stepped out briefly, not wanting to involve himself, but trying to assess whether the escalation might delay the flight. His expression shifted when he recognized the CEO, a man he had seen in business magazines and aviation leadership forums. The pilot realized instantly that the crew had made a grave mistake. But protocols prevented him from overturning the crew's earlier decision unless there was a safety risk. And so the CEO continued to sit quietly, waiting, observing the growing discomfort of those around him. Every gesture he made, every moment of calm, only emphasized the imbalance of how he had been treated. The passengers sensed deeply that this moment would not remain within the confines of the aircraft. Something far bigger was unfolding. Something that would reveal truths the airline wished to hide, but would no longer be able to control because respect, once broken publicly, never disappears quietly. In the moments that followed, the energy on the plane shifted from confusion to a kind of quiet outrage. But what no one realized was that the most powerful part of the story was only just beginning to unfold. Keynote number 5 focuses on what happened when the CEO finally decided to take out his phone. Not to film, not to argue, but to make a single call that would change the course of the situation entirely. Passengers watched closely, sensing something important was happening. His calm demeanor had already earned him silent respect, but the way he handled that call sent a clear message that he wasn't just a man who had been disrespected. He was a man who had influence far beyond what anyone on that plane had imagined. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't complain, and he didn't mention the humiliation he had endured. Instead, he provided his flight number, his seat assignment, and a short description of the incident in a tone so controlled that it made the injustice he experienced appear even more severe by contrast. The person on the other end of the call seemed to understand immediately, and the passengers closest to him noticed the slight change in his posture. Relaxed but purposeful, as if this was not the first time he had handled situations far more serious than this. The call lasted less than a minute, but after he hung up, something shifted in the flight attendants' behavior. Their confidence, which earlier bordered on arrogance, suddenly faltered. They received messages on their device, exchanged glances, and one of them nervously approached the front of the cabin to speak to the lead attendant. A sense of urgency clouded their faces. They kept glancing toward the back of the aircraft where the CEO sat, and the passengers around him noticed the flight crew's growing agitation. It was as though the call he made had set something in motion beyond their control, something that had reached higher authorities much faster than they expected. The flight attendants began to move differently, more carefully, more respectfully, but also with visible anxiety. One of them approached the man who had taken the CEO's seat and whispered something. The man looked startled and uncomfortable, glancing back toward the CEO before responding quietly. Passengers around him leaned in, trying to catch pieces of the conversation. A few seconds later, the attendant quickly returned to the front, and the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. There was no official announcement, no explanation to the passengers, just a quiet panic among the airline staff as they realized that the person they had mishandled was not simply a random customer they assumed would tolerate the disrespect. They had treated someone who held influence at a global scale as if he had no power at all, and the consequences of that misjudgment were beginning to surface. As the CEO remained seated calmly, passengers near him noted that he wasn't angry. If anything, he looked disappointed. That expression struck people harder than any confrontation would have. Several passengers approached him discreetly, offering their support and apologizing on behalf of what they had witnessed. He thanked each one politely, but his calm tone only deepened the intensity of the moment. Meanwhile, the crew received another message, this one causing the lead attendant's face to pale. Something significant had happened, an instruction, a warning, or perhaps direct communication from someone far above their department. They gathered near the galley, whispering in frantic tones as passengers watched with a mix of curiosity and satisfaction. It was clear that whatever the CEO had set in motion was now unfolding across multiple channels beyond the aircraft. Then came the unexpected development, a request from the gate authorities to halt preparations for takeoff. The pilot was instructed to remain in communication with ground control. The lead attendant hurried back and forth, and the murmurs grew louder as passengers realized the plane was no longer merely delayed. It was being held. Some speculated that this was due to the CEO's call, while others whispered that higher-level executives of the airline had been notified. Word spread through the cabin that corporate offices had already been alerted, that senior officials were aware of the situation, and that even the airport authorities were now involved. The situation had escalated far beyond a seat reassignment, and passengers could sense the magnitude of what was unfolding. People continued filming, documenting the crew's increasingly uncomfortable expressions and the visible tension between staff members. The CEO, still silent, created an atmosphere that made everyone reflect on the gravity of what they had witnessed. It wasn't just about race or status anymore. It was about dignity, integrity, and the way one act of discrimination can unravel the very foundations of a company's standard practices. The passengers waited, the crew hesitated, and the plane sat motionless as the weight of what had begun from a single moment of disrespect expanded into something far larger than anyone had anticipated. As the minutes passed and the situation on the plane grew heavier, the atmosphere shifted into something almost electric. Keynote number 6 revolves around the moment everything finally caught up with the people responsible. The moment when accountability arrived, not quietly or gently, but with a force that stripped away every layer of arrogance the staff had displayed earlier. The smirk, the dismissiveness, the assumptions made about a man they believed held no power, all of it began unraveling the instant officials stepped into the jet bridge. Passengers felt the tension ripple through the cabin as ground authorities boarded the plane, their presence sharp and authoritative, carrying an energy that made even the loudest whispers fade into silence. Their eyes scanned the rows, already knowing who they needed to speak to, already aware that something serious had happened here, and that it had reached levels far beyond a routine complaint. The flight attendants, who earlier moved with misplaced confidence, now stood stiff and pale, glancing at one another with expressions that revealed fear, confusion, and dawning realization. The CEO didn't stand or try to draw attention to himself. He sat quietly, waiting, almost as though he knew exactly how this would unfold. The officers or airline supervisors, now informed by higher-ups, approached him with a respect that contrasted sharply with the treatment he had endured earlier. Passengers nearby noticed how carefully they addressed him, how their tone shifted into one of apology, inquiry, and urgency. They asked him softly to explain what had happened, though it was clear they had already received the report from their end. The passengers around him leaned in, watching the exchange with interest because the contrast between how he was treated moments ago and how he was being treated now exposed the true imbalance in the situation. Meanwhile, the flight attendants were summoned to the front of the cabin, where officials questioned them quietly but firmly. Their rehearsed airline smiles were nowhere to be seen. Instead, their voices trembled, their explanations stumbled, and their eyes kept darting toward the passengers who had filmed everything. They knew that this wasn't just a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over. This was documented, witnessed, confirmed, and the airline officials were not approaching it as a small misstep. They were treating it as a serious violation that could have legal, professional, and public consequences. The man who had been offered the CEO's seat and taken it initially looked uncomfortable, shrinking into his seat as the magnitude of the situation settled on him. He avoided eye contact, clearly wishing he had never accepted the upgrade offered under unfair circumstances. Then came the announcement that the CEO needed to step outside the plane momentarily to speak privately with the airline's senior representatives, who were waiting at the gate. Passengers watched as he rose calmly, gathering nothing but his dignity as he walked past the staff who had humiliated him earlier. The expressions on their faces revealed that they finally understood who he really was, not because of fame or power, but because of the integrity he carried and the consequences their actions had summoned. When he reached the jet bridge, the door closed behind him, leaving the rest of the plane buzzing with speculation. Some passengers openly criticized the staff, while others whispered about the potential fallout. Everyone could feel that this incident had spiraled out of the crew's control, and the outcome was no longer theirs to shape. Inside the jet bridge, witnesses saw flashes of the conversation through the small window, officials speaking seriously, the CEO responding in calm, composed sentences, the kind that carried weight without force. The airline representatives appeared deeply apologetic, gesturing with sincerity, perhaps attempting to salvage what could still be saved. Passengers speculated whether the airline was trying to convince him not to escalate the matter further, or if they were offering compensation, policy reviews, or disciplinary action on the spot. Whatever was being discussed, the seriousness of their expression showed that they understood the gravity of their staff's behavior and the broader implications this incident could have once it went public. After several minutes, the CEO re-entered the cabin. The entire plane fell silent, every eye on him, searching his face for a clue as to what had been decided. He walked with the same quiet strength he had displayed since the beginning of the ordeal, but there was now an unmistakable shift in the crew's demeanor. The lead attendant approached him with visible remorse, offering him his original seat back. Passengers recorded as she apologized, an apology that seemed more forced by consequence than guided by conscience. The CEO acknowledged it politely, but without warmth, and the passengers felt a wave of satisfaction wash through the cabin as the power dynamics fully reversed. Moments later, one of the attendants was quietly escorted off the plane, followed by another summoned for questioning. Passengers exchanged looks of shock and agreement. The consequences had begun. The smirk that had started the entire conflict was long gone, replaced by the stark reality of accountability sweeping through the cabin like a storm that no one could stop or ignore.